Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I've said it from the day that I got here until whatever, that there is no connection. You've got Russia. If the president puts Russian salad dressing on his salad tonight, somehow that's a Russian connection.
As the White House fights back over questions regarding the Trump campaign's possible ties to Russia, Republican lawmaker Devin Nunes is facing growing calls to step aside from leading the House Intelligence Committee's probe. Is an independent counsel needed? Then Donald Trump heads to the EPA and signs an executive order to dismantle much of President Obama's climate legacy.
My administration is putting an end to the war on coal. Going to have clean coal, really clean coal.
Plus, we'll look at the future of Internet privacy after the House votes to allow Internet providers to sell your web browsing history and other personal information. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Surrounded by coal miners, President Trump signed an executive order Tuesday to dismantle a slew of climate rules established by President Obama. If carried out, the executive order will virtually guarantee the United States will fail to meet its 2015 Paris Agreement pledge to reduce emissions in order to curb the effects of climate change. The executive order marks the first step to undo Obama's Clean Power Plan to limit plant emissions and replace coal-fired power plants with new solar and wind farms. The Clean Power Plan is considered to be a critical element of the U.S. plan to meet the targets established in the Paris Accord. Environmental and civil rights groups have vowed to fight the executive order. On Tuesday afternoon, protesters gathered in the freezing rain outside Trump Tower in Manhattan to denounce the executive order. Other demonstrators gathered outside the EPA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. with a sign reading, quote, "Get this toxic dump out of the White House." We'll have more on Trump's executive order later in the broadcast. On Capitol Hill, calls are growing for House Republican Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes to step down from his committee's investigation into the possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, as the investigation itself stalls amidst the controversy. On Tuesday, the House Intelligence Committee was scheduled to hear testimony from Sally Yates, who served as acting attorney general before Trump ousted her after she refused to defend his Muslim travel ban. But Nunes canceled the hearing last week, a day after Yates and former CIA head John Brennan, who was also slated to testify Tuesday, informed the government they would contradict some statements that White House officials had made. The Washington Post is reporting White House sought to block Yates's testimony. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer called this report 100% false. The House Intelligence Committee has now canceled all meetings this week amidst the ongoing turmoil, lawmakers calling on Nunes to step down as chair after it emerged he'd met with a source on the grounds of the White House and viewed secret U.S. intelligence reports before supposedly briefing President Trump about the reports. Nunes says the reports indicate Trump or his associates might have been incidentally swept up in surveillance carried out by U.S. spy agencies as they conducted foreign surveillance. Nunes continues to reject the calls to step down and to this day has not shared the secret reports with his fellow committee members. We'll have more on the House Intelligence Committee investigation and other ongoing turmoil with Michael Isikoff after headlines. President Trump is trying to argue that because he's president, he's immune from a defamation lawsuit filed by a former apprentice contestant who's accused him of sexual assault. Summer Zervos says Trump repeatedly sexually assaulted her during a meeting in 2007, kissing her on the lips, pressing his body against hers, groping her breasts, all without her consent. She was among a series of women who accused Trump of sexual assault during the 2016 campaign. She's now suing him for defamation after Trump called her and other women accusers liars. Trump's lawyers are now arguing Trump is immune from all civil lawsuits filed in state court until he leaves office. Oregon Democratic Senator Ron Wyden is calling for U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin to face a government ethics violation investigation after Mnuchin told parents to send all your kids to Lego Batman, a film that was financed by one of Mnuchin's companies. In a letter to Office of Government Ethics Director Walter Schaub, Senator Wyden called the comments troubling and wrote, quote, I am concerned that Secretary Mnuchin's comments may be seen to have a predictable effect on the financial interests of the entity. I request that you review Sec Mnuchin's comments and report any findings to me and the Treasury Department, Senator Wyden wrote. In a historic moment in Britain's history, Prime Minister Theresa May has officially begun the process of Britain leaving the European Union, known as Brexit. This morning, British diplomat Tim Barrow handed the letter to Donald Tusk, the president of the European Council. The letter, known as Article 50, will now trigger 2 years of negotiations about the terms of Britain's departure from the European Union. The First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, is now seeking to hold a referendum on whether Scotland should declare independence from Britain in order to stay in the EU. British voters narrowly approved Brexit in a shocking referendum in late June, leading to the resignation of British Prime Minister David Cameron. In Iraq, Army Lieutenant General Stephen Townsend has admitted the United States probably played a role in the deaths of as many as 200 civilians in an airstrike on Mosul March 17th. Speaking from Baghdad, Townsend said, quote, we still have some assessments to do, and there's also a fair chance that our strike had some role in it, unquote. Meanwhile, Amnesty International continues to criticize the U.S.-backed Iraqi army for having told civilians to stay in Mosul amidst the ongoing offensive rather than to flee. This is Waad Altai speaking about his family members who were killed in November after they followed the Iraqi government's instructions not to leave the city.
My son, Youssef, aged 9, my daughter, Shahad, aged 3, my brother Mahmoud, Ahmed Mahmoud, his wife, Manaya, and their son, Oz Mahmoud, and my other niece, Hanan Saad Ahmed.
In Vermont, 2 immigrant rights activists have returned home after being jailed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents in what local organizers say was an act of political retaliation. 24-year-old Enrique Balcazar and 23-year-old Zuli Palacios are both leaders of the group Migrant Justice. They were arrested by undercover ICE agents in Burlington, Vermont, earlier this month as they were leaving the Migrant Justice Office. Balcazar, who is known as Kike, serves as Vermont Attorney General T.J. Donovan's Immigration Task Force, which was created to respond to the Trump administration's immigration policies. This is Zuli Palacios speaking after being released on Tuesday.
It's so sad to see the situation within the prisons and the jails where they intimidate us, try to make us feel like we're all alone and like there's no one to support us. Once I found out I was going to be released, I wanted to shout out loud and scream for joy. But I also felt so much sadness because, as Kiki said, there are still so many innocent people still in there. There are so many who have had their dreams cut short, so many who have families waiting for them at home. There are so many people we have in captivity, and it's not fair.
A third activist with Migrant Justice, 23-year-old Cesar Alex Carrillo, remains jailed. He was arrested by ICE outside a courthouse 2 days before Zuli and Kike were arrested. This is Carrillo's wife also speaking on Tuesday.
First of all, it's a victory today because I have 2 of the 3 of my family members here back home, but they're still missing one. The one that has the key to my heart. And he's not home. But that doesn't mean the fight is over. That doesn't mean I'm gonna sit and wait. It means I'm gonna get up every day, each and every day, to fight for his freedom. Because like everyone else, he is human. And we are all equal.
Meanwhile, in Seattle, Washington, lawyers for the undocumented dreamer, Daniel Ramirez Medina, say he's been granted bond and will be released later today. He's been jailed by ICE for 6 weeks after being arrested when ICE agents came to his father's home. He was jailed even though he has permission to live and work in the United States under President Obama's DACA program. To see our full interview with Ramirez Medina's lawyer, as well as our interview with migrant justice organizer Will Lambeck in Vermont, go to DemocracyNow.org. The Supreme Court has ruled in favor of Texas death row prisoner Bobby James Moore, whose lawyers argued he should not be executed because he's intellectually disabled. In a 5-3 decision on Tuesday, the Supreme Court ruled Texas had ignored current medical standards and instead used outdated standards in order to determine that Moore was fit for execution. Moore was convicted of killing a grocery store clerk in 1980. In the majority opinion, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote, quote, "Texas cannot satisfactorily explain why it applies current medical standards for diagnosing intellectual disability in other contexts, yet clings to superseded standards when an individual's life is at stake," unquote. California prosecutors have charged anti-choice activist David Daleiden with 15 felonies over his role in secretly filming and releasing heavily edited videos of Planned Parenthood officials in order to falsely accuse the Women's Health Organization of profiting off legal tissue. Daleiden now faces 14 felony counts of unlawfully recording people without their permission and one count of conspiracy to invade privacy. In sports news, athletes on the United States women's national hockey team have won an agreement with USA Hockey after threatening to boycott the upcoming World Championships over inequalities in pay and working conditions between them and their male counterparts. While most of the male players for USA Hockey are professional NHL players earning 6- and 7-figure salaries, the women players rely on USA Hockey for their livelihood. On Tuesday, the women won monthly training stipends and travel and insurance provisions after waging a public battle against the league. Their campaign was supported by fellow crusading women athletes such as Billie Jean King, professional sports leagues including the NFL, NBA, and the WNBA, and 20 U.S. senators. In more sports news, Olympic women gymnasts testified before Congress Tuesday about decades of sexual abuse by USA Gymnastics officials, including Dr. Larry Nassar, who is facing charges of criminal sexual conduct with children. He's been accused by dozens of women and children of penetrating their vaginas with his fingers and covering up the abuse by pretending it was part of a medical treatment. This is Olympic bronze medalist Jamie Dancher speaking about Dr. Nassar.
Dr. Nassar abused me at the USA National Training Center in Texas. He abused me in California, at meets, and all over the world. Many times the abuse took place in my own room, in my own bed. Worse, he abused me in my hotel room in Sydney at the Olympic Games.
In French Guiana, nearly 10,000 people poured into the streets of the capital Tuesday in what local authorities are calling the largest march in the French territory's history. French Guiana, which sits on the northeast tip of South America, has been rocked by protests for weeks, including an ongoing general strike that shut down most schools, businesses, roads, and the main airport Monday and Tuesday. The demonstrators are protesting unemployment, the high cost of living, and the lack of public services in the French territory. French Guiana was colonized by the French in the 17th century, serving first as a slave colony and then as a penal colony, and it's now considered one of France's 5 overseas departments. The French Interior Minister and the Overseas Minister have been dispatched from France to respond to the growing protests and are slated to arrive in French Guiana later today. And longtime civil rights activist Roger Wilkins has died at the age of 85. Born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1932, Wilkins went on to serve as an official in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, including serving as an assistant United States Attorney General. He was also a journalist who wrote for both the New York Times and the Washington Post, and a professor of history at George Mason University for nearly 20 years. His uncle Roy Wilkins led the NAACP for more than 2 decades, from 55 to 1977. This is Roger Wilkins speaking about the civil rights movement with fellow activist Julian Bond as part of the Oral History Project Explorations in Black Leadership.
Every fall, there was at least one violent, hideous outbreak in this evolving morality tale. And I remember with Clinton, Tennessee, and a guy named Casper blowing up stuff.
Yes, John Casper.
Right. There was, of course, Little Rock. There was Plaquemine Parish in
some
right
little
outside
town
of
in
New Orleans.
Texas a year before.
Right. So all of a sudden you're energized because it really was good and evil. And of course, in that period, you also had the Montgomery bus boycott and the emergence of Martin King. So all of a sudden, instead of getting depressed, what you're seeing is a morality tale in which black people are becoming energized.
That was Roger Wilkins speaking with fellow civil rights activist Julian Bond, who died in 2015. Wilkins died Sunday in Kensington, Maryland, at the age of 85. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Calls are growing for House Republican Intelligence Committee Chair Devin Nunes to step down from his committee's investigation into possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. On Tuesday, the House Intelligence Committee was scheduled to hear testimony from Sally Yates, who served as acting attorney general before Trump ousted her after she refused to defend his Muslim travel ban. But Nunes canceled the hearing last week, a day after Yates and former CIA head John Brennan, who was also slated to testify Tuesday, informed the government they would contradict some statements that White House officials had made. According to the Washington Post, the White House then sought to block their testimony, but the White House denies this. Meanwhile, Nunes is also continuing to face criticism over his actions last week when he traveled to the White House to personally brief President Trump on allegations that he'd seen evidence that U.S. intelligence may have incidentally swept up communication by Trump's transition team after the November election. Nunes, who served on Trump's transition team, later revealed the evidence he saw was shown to him on the White House grounds the night before by a source he's refused to identify. No Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee have seen the evidence. Meanwhile, the Senate Intelligence Committee is preparing to question Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and a close advisor, about a previously undisclosed meeting he had with the head of a state-run Russian bank currently under U.S. sanction. On Tuesday, White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer defended the administration's actions during a heated exchange with April Ryan of American Urban Radio Networks.
With all of these investigations, questions of what is, how does this administration try to revamp its image? 2.5 months in, you've got this Yates story today. You've got other things going on. You've got Russia. You've got wiretap, and you've got.
No, we don't have that. You. I know.
Investigations on Capitol Hill.
No, I get it, but you keep. I've said it from the day that I got here until whatever, that there is no connection. You've got Russia. If the president puts Russian salad dressing on his salad tonight, somehow that's a Russian connection. But every single person, no, that's, I appreciate your agenda here, but the reality is, oh, no, hold on. No, at some point, report the facts. The facts are that every single person who has been briefed on this subject has come away with the same conclusion. Republican, Democrat, so I'm sorry that disgusts you. You're shaking your head. I appreciate it, but understand this, that at some point the facts are what they are, and every single person who has been briefed on this situation with respect to the situation with Russia, Republican, Democrat, Obama appointee, career, have all come to the same conclusion. At some point, April, you're going to have to take no for an answer with respect to whether or not there was collusion.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer speaking on Tuesday. To talk more about the probes into possible collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign, we're joined by Michael Isikoff, chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News. His new piece is titled "Russia Probe in Turmoil as Top Dem Calls for Nunes' Recusal." So welcome back to Democracy Now!, Michael. Can you take us through what happened last week right into this week?
Well, basically, it's, we started last week with the rather astonishing testimony from FBI Director James Comey that there has been an active counterintelligence investigation into whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government since late last July, so more than 3 months before the election, which really sort of took Republicans back. They were not expecting that. They never imagined that that Comey was going to break as much news as he did that day. And then the next day, Devin Nunes, the chairman, goes to the White House and sees these documents that nobody else has seen. Secretly, which seems to take the investigation off in a different direction on the question of whether there was, in fact, some improper incidental collection of surveillance of Trump transition people by U.S. intelligence. Now, remember, Nunes was reacting to Comey shooting down the president's tweets. This all began, 2 weeks earlier when the president was talking about it started on his tweet storm about how President Obama had wiretapped him. Comey shot that down, said he'd seen no information to back that up, as did Mike Rogers, the NSA director. So the White House, on its heels, suddenly the next day has Nunes down there showing him documents that might support what Trump seemed to say in some fashion. And I think that's where this whole thing broke down. At that point, Nunes is trying to take the investigation off in a different direction. He cancels the hearing for Sally Yates and John Brennan. At this point, with the disclosure that somebody at the White House let Devin Nunes in, you have all the Democrats on the committee saying Nunes has to recuse himself. And so this is a committee investigation that is effectively stalled at this point.
So for people who aren't following this that closely, that revelation that he went to the White House the day after Comey gave his testimony that shocked Republicans, where he said they were investigating Trump, that wasn't known until recently. It was the next day.
Until this week. Yeah.
Until this week. It was the next day when he publicly went to the White House to brief Trump, to tell him that conversations might have been swept up incidentally in some surveillance, that everyone knew that he was at the White House. Now, so can you explain, well, let's go to Devin Nunes himself, speaking on CNN on Monday, defending his previously undisclosed trip to the White House.
Here's the problem. The Congress has not been given this information, these documents, and that's the problem. So because this is executive branch, it was distributed widely through the executive branch. This was from November, December, and January. And these were reports, just let me reiterate, this had nothing to do with Russia, nothing to do with the Russia investigation. There is no way for the folks that I had been working with to actually to bring this forward to light. There was no way I could view that because they couldn't get it to the House Intelligence Committee.
And so explain what the intelligence chair is saying, that he had to go to the White House. And then you've written, Michael, about who you believe it was he met with at the White House. And it raises the question of whether the White House didn't give him the information so that he could publicly talk about having it the next day, which would somehow corroborate Trump, say he wasn't lying. So as he's pushing for his health care plan, it doesn't go down because everyone's calling him a liar.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a morass and a diversion at this point. Look, remember, the week before, Trump goes on Tucker Carlson on Fox and says, you're going to see something in the next couple of weeks that's going to justify my tweets. Doesn't say what it is, but suggests the White House has some information. It's right after that, a few days later, that Nunes goes down to the White House to see this information. He says it wasn't coordinated with the president. The White House says they don't know who Nunes was meeting with, which seems bizarre. It was on the White House grounds. Somebody had to clear him in. So from a distance, it looks like there was some sort of collusion here between Nunes, who's supposed to be investigating this matter in an independent fashion, and the White House, which is to some extent the subject of the investigation. So that's a reason that so many people, certainly on the Democratic side, have lost confidence in Nunes. I did point out in the piece that Michael Ellis, who was the chief counsel for the House Intelligence Committee under Chairman Nunes, just recently went to work in the White House counsel's office on national security and intelligence matters, so that there's been a lot of speculation that he would have been a natural person to facilitate this arrangement between Nunes and the White House. But neither Nunes nor the White House is talking, so it's very hard at this point to know precisely what happened, other than from a distance. It does seem like there was some form of collaboration here between Nunes and the White House.
So are you suggesting that once Comey knocked the Republicans off their feet by saying he was investigating Trump, that they had to take this in a different direction? So you have Nunes working with the White House and now sort of exploding the investigation, and then talk about who was supposed to testify on Tuesday, yesterday, the hearing that was canceled, and the significance of what they were going to say.
Yeah, well, look, Sally Yates, to some extent, when she was acting attorney general before she was fired by President Trump, she's an Obama holdover, had set the ball in motion by alerting the White House counsel's office to what she thought was concerning evidence about Michael Flynn's conversations with the Russian ambassador. These conversations took place on December 29th, the same day that President Obama had imposed sanctions on the Russian government over the election hacking. Everybody at the White House, from Sean Spicer to Vice President Pence, had denied that Flynn had talked to the Russian ambassador Kislyak about the sanctions issue. Yates had evidence from the U.S. intelligence community that was not true, and she went to the White House to alert the White House counsel's office that public statements were being made about these conversations that were not factual. The intelligence community had evidence that Flynn had, in fact, talked about sanctions. The suggestion is that he was telling the Russian ambassador, don't worry about what President Obama has just done. We're going to take another look at all this once we come into office in a few weeks. That arguably was undermining what the then President of the United States had just done. We only have one president at a time. Yates's main issue was the White House is saying things that publicly that are not true. That is ultimately borne out by the fact that the White House fired Michael Flynn over this issue, over misleading Vice President Pence about the nature of these conversations. All of this was something that Sally Yates was going to address in her public testimony. I should point out, though, Amy, that in some respects, although this whole investigation by the House committee at this point has turned into a fiasco, the ball was actually advanced yesterday because as a result of that Washington Post account suggesting that the administration was trying to shut down Sally Yates, Spicer went out there at the White House and says, no, we want her to testify. We're not going to invoke executive privilege on this. And I thought that was an astonishing admission by Spicer. He actually gave the green light for Sally Yates to testify. White Houses, Democrat and Republican, for years jealously guard executive privilege and often invoke it to thwart congressional investigations. Spicer, whether this was by design or not, essentially gave all that away. And so at some point, if not the House, then the Senate will call Sally Yates, and we will hear what she has to say.
And what is the significance of Nunes saying no? He wants to hear once again from FBI Director Comey.
Well, look, Nunes may or may not have a legitimate issue that he wants to raise here about incidental collection. And I should point out that, for many years since the Snowden disclosures, there's been a lot of talk among civil libertarians about the dangers of incidental collection, that Americans' conversations are swept up by the intelligence community when they are targeting others, either through FISA warrants or through overseas collection. Innocent Americans are caught up in that, incidentally collected. What happens to those conversations? How much, to what extent are they distributed? That is a legitimate issue to talk about, and there's nothing wrong with investigating it. The problem is that the way Nunes has gone about this, he's turned it into a partisan matter. He seems to be fronting for the White House. What he could have done is taken Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the committee, down with him to look at these documents. So it would be clear this was a bipartisan matter, and bring in the Democrats to work with him on this. Instead, he did it on his own unilaterally, and as a result, the whole committee investigation seems to be imploding.
So you wrote a piece a while ago, Michael, Uncovering Clinton, a reporter's story, the book.
That was a book
that you wrote.
It was a book, yeah.
Uncovering Clinton, a reporter's story, all about the probes of Bill Clinton
years ago.
And Whitewater independent counsel Kenneth Starr.
Yeah.
Do you think an independent counsel is needed in this case?
No. First of all, and I think the number one priority should be to get the facts before the American public. I mean, people want to know at this point, what exactly did happen during the election, answer those questions about whether there was collusion or collaboration. If we had the appointment of an independent counsel, and by the way, it would have to be under Justice Department regulations. We no longer have the Independent Counsel Act. That would be strictly a criminal probe that would go on for a lengthy period of time, cloaked in grand jury secrecy, and the public may never learn what the outcome was. If there are criminal charges, we'd know if there was a statutory violation of the law by somebody. But, there's a lot of facts here that may or may not be criminal that the public deserves to know. Do you remember, Amy, when Eric Holder came in as Attorney General, he appointed John Durham to investigate torture by the CIA and the Pentagon to determine whether there was any statutory violations there. What happened? Durham spent several years with a grand jury investigation, never brought any charges, and never produced a public report because independent counsels don't. So the public learned nothing from that endeavor.
What about an independent commission or a select committee?
I think that would have been a good idea several months ago if you could get bipartisan support for it. But at this point, it's not clear you could ever get bipartisan support. Remember, to create an independent commission, you need legislation passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president. Then you have to appoint commissioners. Then they have to hire a staff. I mean, that could drag this thing on even longer. I think the top priority ought to be for the committees, and now that the House seems to be completely sidetracked, the Senate really has the obligation here to move quickly, hold public hearings, call witnesses before to testify in open session under oath, and see if we can get some answers to these basic questions about whether or not there was some form of collusion or collaboration between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. There's been a lot of smoke here, a lot of suggestions, a lot of circumstantial evidence cited about contacts or communications. We don't know who was communicating with who about what. It's exceedingly murky, and this is a huge issue in which the public deserves answers.
Okay, in the last minutes we have details have emerged about this December meeting between President Trump's close advisor, son-in-law Jared Kushner, with the head of the U.S.-sanctioned Russian state bank. President Obama imposed the sanctions in 2014. The bank disclosed the meeting on Monday and said Kushner was acting as the head of Kushner Companies, which contradicted the statements of White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, who said Kushner was acting as a Trump advisor during the meeting, not as a private developer. If you could talk about the significance of this and also the piece you just recently wrote, why Manafort's offer to cooperate and probe is less than meets the eye.
Yeah, well, first of all, on the Kushner thing, I mean, that is a important contradiction there. Was Kushner operating as a private business person when he met this Russian banker, or was he acting as a representative of the President of the United States?
Because it was after his election.
Right, right. So Kushner needs to explain himself, and testify in public. For one thing, it would give us a chance to actually hear him and take his measure. All we do is see him coming in and out of buildings. The guy never talks. We don't know what he's like, and it would be worth hearing from him directly. But I mean, that's another example of why we need public testimony. On Manafort, obviously a key figure in this probe. He was Trump's campaign manager. He had all these connections going back for years as the political consultant for Yanukovych, the pro-Putin president of Ukraine. He had these business dealings with Deripaska, the pro-Putin oligarch in Russia, and he is a key witness. Now, Nunes announced last week that Manafort had offered to come in and testify. When you actually looked at the statement that Manafort's representatives put out, they didn't say testify. They say provide information. It was very carefully worded and hedged, saying it was going to be about Russian interference in the election, not about his work for Yanukovych, not about his business dealings with Deripaska, all of which might be relevant to the broader inquiry. And it's not at all clear that he's willing to testify in public under oath. So that's another example of where I think the committees need to be much more aggressive, and at this point the Senate needs to be much more aggressive in moving the ball forward here and having some public testimony under oath of key witnesses. That's the only way we're going to learn information. And by the way, also start using their subpoena power, which they have not yet done. They need documents before they begin this testimony. That's legitimate. Every investigation does. But you got to start moving quickly. And, they've sent preservation letters, but I haven't yet seen any evidence of subpoenas.
Back on Kushner, they've already said he's not going to testify in public.
Right, and I find that baffling. I think at this point he ought to be testifying in public, and it's not clear to me. And this is another example of why I think if the committees agree to that, I think, or the Senate agrees to that, it's not being as aggressive and forward-looking as it should be.
Michael Isikoff, I want to thank you for being with us, Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News. His latest piece will link to Russia probe in turmoil as top Dem calls for Nunes' recusal. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.
There are cockles and broken glass spread across the floor. The door is wide open and the sand drifts all down the broken panes in the window, reflected light in from the sky. This is no longer my house, it's being claimed by the sea. Starfish is dying down by the laundry. machine is half full of seawater washed in by
Claimed by the Sea by French for Rabbits. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump signed an executive order Tuesday to dismantle a slew of climate rules established by President Obama. If carried out, the executive order will virtually guarantee that the United States will fail to meet its 2015 Paris Agreement pledge to reduce emissions in order to curb the effects of climate change. The executive order marks the first step to undo Obama's Clean Power Plan to limit emissions and replace coal-fired power plants with new solar and wind farms. Trump signed the executive order at a ceremony at the Environmental Protection Agency while being surrounded by a group of coal miners, as well as EPA head Scott Pruitt, who himself denies the human impact on climate change.
Today, I'm taking bold action to follow through on that promise. My administration is putting an end to the war on coal. Going to have clean coal, really clean coal. With today's executive action, I am taking historic steps to lift the restrictions on American energy, to reverse government intrusion, and to cancel job-killing regulations.
The executive order also ends President Obama's 2013 Climate Action Plan, which outlined the federal government's approach to curbing climate change. Trump never mentioned climate change or global warming during his remarks, even though 2016 was the warmest year on record, breaking the record set in 2015. He also only mentioned the EPA's mission to protect the environment once.
We're going to continue to expand energy production, and we will also create more jobs in infrastructure, trucking, and manufacturing. This will allow the EPA to focus on its primary mission of protecting our air and protecting our water. Together, we are going to start a new energy revolution, one that celebrates American production on American soil.
For more, we're joined by Jacqueline Patterson, director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, joining us from New Orleans. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jacqueline. Talk about the effect of this executive order, its significance.
Yes, it is so significant. Thanks for having me. So there's so many far-reaching implications for this rule if the actions go forward as presented. Certainly, fortunately, labor experts and market experts say that regardless of this rule, which seeks to release the restriction on leasing of federal lands for coal, they're saying that it's not necessarily going to bring back the coal industry. But if it did, the coal industry is so harmful not only to the communities that are host to coal-fired power plants, but also to the very workers whose jobs that President Trump purports to save, including the fact that 76,000 coal miners have died of black lung disease since 1968, while the industry has fought against the regulations to protect them from coal mine dust. So we have those implications. We have implications like the communities that are host to coal-fired power plants are choking down sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, arsenic, lead, not to mention that coal-based energy production is the #1 contributor to carbon dioxide emissions, which is the #1 greenhouse gas emission that drives climate change. So those implications are significant.
And can you talk about how, in particular, it will affect communities of color?
Yeah, so for example, 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, and we know that with the emissions such as sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide, they're known to have a link to exacerbating respiratory conditions such as asthma. We also know that 71% of African Americans live in counties in violation of air pollution standards, and we know that the African American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter into the hospital from asthma attacks and 2 to 3 times more likely to die of asthma attacks. When we connect the dots in terms of exposure and in terms of the health conditions of African American children and people, we start to see the ties in terms of the impact, the disproportionate impact of the coal industry in particular on communities of color. We know that African American adults are more likely to die from lung disease, but far less likely to smoke. When we put out our report, cold-blooded, putting profits before people. And back in 2012, we went around and we visited with communities that were host to coal-fired power plants, and we heard time and time again from folks who had half the kids in their school were on inhalers, half the people in their church were on respirators. I spoke to a fellow in Indiana whose wife had died of lung disease. They lived within seeing distance of a coal-fired power plant. She had never smoked a day in her life. I spoke to a woman whose father worked in a coal plant and who died of lung cancer but had never smoked a day in his life. So we see these stories, we hear these stories, and we see the statistics, and the disproportionate exposure and the differential impact are clear.
I want to turn to Earth Justice Policy Vice President Martin Hayden, who questioned whether President Trump's executive order will have a significant effect on the coal industry.
Are a net exporter of coal by a long shot. So producing more coal isn't going to make us more energy independent. And the other piece of producing more coal, and you saw many of the coal company executives say this last night, that while it may raise coal production some, it's not going to create many more jobs because they are more automated today. That the trend has been fewer and fewer jobs in the coal fields, irrespective of how much coal is mined, because they're using more mechanized approaches and less people approaches.
So that issue, Jacqueline Patterson, of what the president keeps pushing, the issue of coal jobs.
Yes. So as I was saying at the very beginning, both the labor industry and markets say that it's not necessarily going to bring back coal. I was saying what the implications would be if it did in any way increase coal production, coal-based energy production in the United States. But then there's the other side of the fact that even if we're exporting coal and other countries are using coal, as we know, any use of coal burning to produce energy affects climate change overall. And we know that communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to feel the impacts from climate change. And so whether it's communities that have poor housing stock, communities that are underinsured, communities that whose homes are located in the floodplains, we see that these communities are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change and more likely to be impacted by climate change. We know that these communities are often the ones that don't have access to healthy and nutritious foods. They have food insecurity, and we know that shifts in agricultural yields is another impact of climate change, and that this might make food insecurity even greater in these communities. So the far-reaching implications of any type of increase in coal-based energy production are felt, no matter where it happens, are felt globally, and particularly in vulnerable communities and vulnerable countries.
We've been talking about coal plants, but let's talk about coal-fired plants. Jacqueline, talk about your own growing up in Chicago.
Yeah, so I grew up on the south side of Chicago, where there were 3 coal-fired power plants within a 15-mile radius of where I lived. The Fisk and Crawford plants on the south side of Chicago and the State Line plant on the northwest side of Indiana. So unbeknownst to me, really, because, you know, these things are there and you often just don't know the impacts of these facilities in your community, I was living in this toxic corridor. And fast forward to today, when I was doing the work on the cold-blooded report, I visited with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, PERO, and others in Chicago who were doing work on the Fisk and Crawford plants. And they had done a partnership with the Harvard School of Public Health, and through the community campus partnership, they found that 40 asthma deaths and 1,000 hospitalizations were attributed to the Fisk and Crawford coal plants, which gave them the fuel that they needed to be able to inform the community, which eventually resulted in the city council passing an ordinance around clean air, and Mayor Rahm Emanuel giving a ultimatum to either clean these coal plants up or shut them down, which eventually did happen. And so, again, I was growing up in harm's way. My father passed away a few years ago of lung disease, and now and his doctor specifically cited that it was due to environmental exposures. And now I wonder what the cumulative impact might have been of living on the south side of Chicago in that toxic corridor with those 3 coal plants and other toxins in the air.
Finally, Jacqueline Patterson, just the overall broader issue of cuts to the EPA and the whole direction the Trump administration is going in. I mean, he signed this executive order at the Environmental Protection Agency, which he said he is going to slash by almost a third. This is with the acquiescence of the head of the EPA, right, the former Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt, who sued the EPA 14 times before he's now become its head.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and unfortunately, not only if it was just slashed off of the EPA budget in general, that would be bad enough, but the fact that it's targeted slashing of environmental justice programs that are meant to protect communities like Mossville, Louisiana, which is in this petrochemical corridor, which is a cancer cluster, which has already these existing impacts for their communities like Uniontown, Alabama, which again has multiple assaults in terms of its environmental exposures. The communities across the nation that are, again, disproportionately communities of color, disproportionately indigenous communities, and low-income communities in Appalachia who are suffering under the impacts of mountaintop removal and so forth and so on. And so the Environmental Protection Agency, as per its name, it is there to ensure that we have the monitoring and the enforcement of safeguards for our health and well-being. So I shudder to think what the impacts will be if that agency does not serve that function.
Jacqueline Patterson, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, speaking to us from New Orleans. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the House votes on Internet privacy. Stay with us.
Don't let the fear, don't let the fear, don't let the fear take over. Fear take over. Don't let the fear take over. Don't let the fear, don't let the fear, don't let the fear take over. See, you are magic, what you think it comes true, so don't let that fear take over. Don't let the fear take over. Let that fear, don't let the fear, don't let the fear, trying to keep steady. Steady, trying to keep on solid ground, trying to keep on solid, trying to keep level, trying to keep from falling down, trying to keep steady, trying to keep on solid ground, trying to keep on solid.
Listen, by which prophet? This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we end today's show looking at the future of Internet privacy following Tuesday's vote in the House to allow Internet providers to sell your web browsing history and other personal information. By a vote of 215 to 205, the House passed a bill to overturn the Federal Communication Commission's landmark broadband privacy rules established under the Obama administration. The vote will give companies like Verizon, Comcast, and AT&T more power to collect people's sensitive data, including your Internet browsing history, as well as to sell that information. Last week, the Senate also approved the measure in a vote largely split across party lines. President Trump's expected to sign the bill. For more, we go to Washington to speak with Laura Moy, Deputy Director of the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown University Law Center. Her new piece for the Daily Dot is titled, "Think You Can Protect Your Privacy from Internet Providers Without FCC Rules? Good luck." Laura Moy, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of the House vote yesterday.
Right. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on. Right. I mean, strange days in Washington. At a time when Americans overwhelmingly want more privacy protection, yesterday the House of Representatives, as you said, voted 215 to 205 to eliminate these really important privacy rules that would protect the information that Americans have no choice but to share with their Internet service providers from being sold or shared without their permission. So, you know, essentially when you go online, you have to tell your Internet provider what website you want to visit, what app you want to use, so that it knows where to route the traffic online, knows which information to send you and where to send the information that you're communicating. Americans pay for that service. They don't expect that information to be shared or used for other purposes or sold without their permission. But repealing the rules that were put in place last October will do just that. Will allow internet providers, as you said, like Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T to share or sell that information without permission.
So give us a concrete example of how this would work, something you looked up and how that's going to make its way to some company.
Right. So, if let's say that you are browsing the web and you are visiting a gun auction site or a healthcare site, perhaps a site that expresses your political viewpoints. Because you're visiting those sites, your internet provider gets to see that you are traveling to those sites on the web. If you're going to WebMD.com to look up a health condition, your internet provider sees that information. And now, with repeal of the rules, it is possible that internet providers will see this as a green light to go ahead and sell that information about you to entities that might want to use it, for example, to track you or monitor you, or just to market you related goods to the things that you're interested in.
So you're looking up something on addiction, and then they start to target you as perhaps someone who is addicted, or you're afraid to start looking things up and getting vital information because of that very tactic.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Americans absolutely need internet connectivity in today's modern era. You need to go online to search for a job. You need to go online to complete your education. You need to go online often to communicate with your healthcare provider or conduct your banking. And we want people to use the internet, to view it as a safe space to communicate with others, to express their political viewpoints, to carry out these vitally important everyday activities, and to do so without fear that the information that they share with their internet service provider will be used to harm them in some way.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
Republicans argued that the FCC overstepped its mandate, and it's the job of the Federal Trade Commission to regulate privacy. This is Republican Congressmember Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee.
Having two privacy cops on the beat will create confusion within the internet ecosystem and will end up harming consumers. Third, the FCC already has authority to enforce privacy obligations of broadband service providers on a case-by-case basis. These broadband privacy rules are unnecessary and are just another example of big government overreach.
And that's Republican Congressmember Marsha Blackburn, who, according to Vocative, has received over $500,000 in campaign donations, internet providers, including AT&T, Comcast, and Verizon. If you could respond to what she's saying, this should be the FTC's area. And also the fact that the Republicans have pushed this when President Trump is fighting against surveillance himself or of himself.
That's right, yeah. So as Representative Blackburn stated, the Federal Trade Commission has done a lot of work on privacy over the past couple decades. Unfortunately for us, the Federal Trade Commission does not have any authority to regulate internet service providers. So a couple years ago, Internet service was classified as a telecommunications service because over 4 million Americans wanted it to be regulated as a common carrier service. And as a result, the Federal Trade Commission does not have the authority to protect the privacy of Americans from uses by Internet providers. So she is right that the Federal Trade Commission has done a lot of good work on privacy, but it is not true that the Federal Trade Commission can protect us here. And then you mentioned, of course, that President Trump has spoken out about surveillance or suspected surveillance of himself. This is a little bit ridiculous because President Trump and the Trump White House has spoken out in support of the repeal of the privacy rule. Repeal of the privacy rule will, in addition to giving Internet providers the green light to share and sell information without consumers' consent, might help expand mass surveillance programs as well.
In what way? We have 10 seconds.
So because of the way that internet providers are required to protect information and not share it without a lawful order with the government, if it's classified as protected information under this rule, with repeal of the rule, that could lead to the expansion of some of these surveillance programs.
We have to leave it there. Laura Moy, thanks so much for joining us from the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.